Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. We are from group 7 and the member of this group is Siti Lailatul Saadah and my partner is Ninda Sofatul Islamiyah. And now we will discuss about more and verbs, auxiliary verb phrase. And then here there are two parts, and the part 1 is lexical and auxiliary verbs, and then the part 2 is contraction that depend on auxiliaries. So in the part 1 there are 8 kinds. Number 1 is tense and time. Number 2 is the contract between lexical and auxiliary verbs. Number 3 is modal auxiliaries. Number 4 the perfect auxiliary. Number 5 the progressive auxiliary. Number 6 the passive auxiliary. Number 7 where auxiliaries fit in the structure of verb phrase. Number 8 auxiliary verb phrase and adverbials. And then in the part 2 there are 4 kinds. Number 1 is passive sentence. Number 2 negative sentence and auxiliary do. Number 3 question fronting the test auxiliary. And the last is more on have and be. And this is part 1, lexical and auxiliary verbs. Number 1 is tense and time. Verb forms that are tensed are traditionally called finite verb forms. All other verb forms are non-finite or not tensed. Every sentence must contain a finite verb. In the absence of any auxiliary, it is the lexical verb that is tensed or finite. Present tense form consists of the basic stem v itself plus the present tense inflection s, and it is past tense form consists of the stem plus the past tense inflection. In fact, lexical verbs only change their form in the present tense when the subject new phrase is he, she, it, or any noun phrase that could be replaced by one of these pronouns. Number 2 is the contrast between lexical and auxiliary verbs. Lexical verbs are also known as main verbs. These verbs act as independent clause, definitely not a clause but an independent word. They stand on their own and do not need another verb to make a sentence significant. They simply tell you about the action in which the subject is involved. For example, she laughed on the joke, or he sings really well. Auxiliary verbs are the contrast of lexical verbs. They cannot stand independent. These verbs are complete when the sentence has a lexical verb in it. These verbs bring about a functional or a grammatical change to the clause or a sentence. In fact, we can say that auxiliary verbs support lexical verb and make the sentence complete. Hence, they can be called helping verbs, auxiliary verb, plus main, or lexical verb 1. The example: the cooks have cooked well, or Maria has submitted her assignment. And then number 3 is modal auxiliaries. Modal auxiliary verbs is modals for short or special. quite different from other verbs, both lexical and auxiliary. For a start, modals are always tensed or finite. They do not have untensed or non-finite forms. This distinguishes modals from the primary auxiliaries. These do, have, and be, and from lexical verbs. In present, um, in present can, in past could, in present will, in past would, in present shall, in past should, in present may, in past might. For example, in present, he say he will come. In the past is, he said he would come. And then number 4 is the perfect auxiliary. The auxiliary have is used to form the perfect tense. The first, present perfect, has. Example, Cassie has lived in Australia for 2 years. In the past perfect, had. The example, by 9 o'clock last night, he had found asleep. In the future perfect, have been. The example is, on Monday, we will have been going to Bandung. In the conditional perfect, the example, we would have won the game if we had a great player like him. And then, how modal auxiliary and perfect auxiliary in the sentence. Modal auxiliary and modal auxiliary before perfect auxiliary before lexical verb. The example, auxiliary plus have plus past participle. The example is, it must have been hot last summer, or she must have cold. And then number 5 is the progressive auxiliary. Progressive B demands that the following verb has the ing form, or you can call it progressive participle, to reflect its dependence on preceding progressive B. You will be pleased to hear that the progressive participle ing form is completely regular invariant for all verbs in the language. We can function either as an auxiliary or as a lexical verbs. I will represent progressive as prog and decorate it with the tense future. The prog present is, in the prog past was. Progressive auxiliary will only have the tense future if it is the first the sequence. Having introduced modal auxiliary and perfect auxiliary, I can give example in which prog or progressive auxiliary so occurs with modal auxiliary, with perfect auxiliary, and with both modal auxiliary and perfect auxiliary. The first, you may be wondering about the future. Modal auxiliary plus progressive auxiliary. Number 2, Jack has been using the bike. It is perfect auxiliary plus progressive auxiliary. Number 3, Eddie might have been looking for you. It is modal auxiliary plus perfect auxiliary and plus progressive auxiliary. Following the model in 1. Progressive B appears in it is or non-finite past tense form. Following perfect have in it is 2. And the 3 is it appears in the perfect participle form. Modal before perfect, before progressive, before lexical. Number 6 is the passive auxiliary. Sentences that include the passive auxiliary verb be are said to be in the passive voice. The obvious point to make is that be is also the progressive auxiliary. How to distinguish between progressive be and passive be? The answer lies in the form of the following verb. Following progressive be, we have seen a verb adopts the progressive participle form. But following passive be, a verb adopts the passive participle form. And then the next explain is Sister Ninda Suhatul Islamiyah.
A passive auxiliary will be the first word in the phrase form of be plus past participle. A progressive auxiliary will be the first word in the phrase form of be plus present participle. Passive auxiliary is always going to be form of be plus past participle. The form of be can be, is, being, or been. If a past participle follows, it's part of a passive voice expression. Be can be expressed passively or progressively or continuously like any other verb. So you might have two forms of be next to each other, but it's the first one that determines passive or progressive. The 7 is where auxiliary fit in the structure of VP. The lexical verb from a VP constituent with that lexical verb auxiliary verbs are necessarily followed by VP, also verb that take VP complement verb. Auxiliary verb is the head of its VP and takes a VP complement. The 8 is auxiliary VP and adverb. The interaction between auxiliary VP and adverb they are: the first is if an adverb precedes a verb, assume it modifies the following VP. Example, the hippo could easily have killed me. The second is assume the sentence final adverb modify and form of VP constituent with the lexical VP. Example, they have been complaining for the fun of it. Part 2. Construction that depend on auxiliaries. The first is passive sentence. The object in active sentence will be the subject of the corresponding passive sentence. Example, active sentence, the teacher taught students. Passive sentence, students taught by the teacher. The by phrase is optional, it functions as adverb. Converting active into passive sentence only shifting object into subject position. It means only lexical verb that take object direct and indirect or can fix passive sentence. The second is negative sentence and auxiliary do. Auxiliary verb do is used in negative and interrogative question sentence in verbal sentence. Do is one of three auxiliary verbs in English: be, do, have. We use do to make a negative do plus not, to make a question form, and to make a verb more empathetic, which include the auxiliary verb do. There are only three, namely do, does, did, all start with the letter D. Modal auxiliary verbs plus not. Modal auxiliary verbs are auxiliary verb They are used to emphasize or modify the meaning of the main verb. The words that are modal verbs are can, could, shall, should, will, would, may, might, and must. The third is questions fronting the tense auxiliary. The auxiliary verb also serves to clarify the main verb. Therefore, the auxiliary verb cannot stand alone without the verb. This auxiliary verb is used to show tense, aspect, modal, emphasis, and so. Example, the first is Marvel does it. Does Marvel it? The rule of forming the question is this. The tense auxiliary verb moves in front of the subject. The fourth is more and have and be. Have and be can function both as auxiliary functioning as a lexical verb, behaving like an auxiliary verb, and lexical verb when functioning as helpers. They behave like helpers, fetching C in the question and accepting the negative particle, do, which is usually required without an auxiliary, is not grammatical with the aids have and be. Example, are they going? They are not going. Surprisingly, talk can behave like an auxiliary or like a lexical verb even when it is functioning as a lexical verb. Okay, we are from 7 group. Apologize. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.